Scope refers to where an object or variable is accessible by the rest of your program, or where it lives. For example, if we have two functions, and inside both of these functions we have a variable called kitchen, and inside at the end of the function we're just going to return the value of this variable. Then the scope of kitchen, as it applies to some function, you can only access it if you're inside this function. Same with another function here. If you have kitchen inside here, defined inside the variable, the scope of it lies only inside this function. It's a local variable to this function. What that means is that if we have this, let me put this in an actual JavaScript tag. Then if we try to access kitchen from outside the function, and outside the function meaning we're not calling console.log kitchen inside of it, we're outside the function scope and we're calling it from here, console.log kitchen, then what's going to happen is that we're going to get it undefined. Kitchen is not defined. So if we define, console.log some function and console.log another function, then we're going to be able to get those kitchen variables because that's what the function call is returning. Now we're calling the function, we're inside the function, and we're returning the variable, the local variable of each of the functions. So we're going to get purple and then we're going to get green in the console. And that's how it is. If you define a variable outside of both of these functions, say we name it variable superKitchen equals orange, then if we run some function and inside of some function we log to the console superKitchen equals the value of superKitchen that we're trying to access, this is going to work. So now we should get superKitchen equals orange since it's before the return statement, and then we're going to return the kitchen local variable inside some function, which is purple, and then finally green. And when we run that, we see that superKitchen equals orange and purple and green. So the thing about scope, the main thing about scope, is that if you're in a higher level, and when I say higher level, I mean, this variable is defined outside of these functions. So this variable is on a higher level, on an outside level. This function is on a lower level than the scope. It's like inside the scope, like on level under. If you're trying to access superKitchen from a scope underneath the scope that you're in, meaning from this function, then it's going to work. But vice versa is not going to work. Meaning that if you, like how we have it down here, we're at a higher level scope and we're trying to access a variable that's defined on a lower level inside this function. It's basically, you can think of it as like if you have two functions defined next to each other, you can think of it kind of like they would be neighbors, right? And this would be a house, this would be another house. They both know that the house exists, meaning we can call the functions from this level of scope, but we have no idea what's inside the house. Inside the house, trying to access any local variables or methods, we're not going to be able to. That's kind of basics run through of how scope works. To give another sort of quick example of how scope works, let's name a variable index or current page equals to 0, right? And then we're going to have a function that is going to increment the page by 1 every time that we call it. Since we're inside this function and the scope of the variable that we're trying to access is at a higher level, or it's outside the function, we can access it and we can modify it. So if we put current page plus equals 1, or just current page plus plus, and then after every function call we're going to print out the value, the new value of current page. Once we run this, it's going to say 1. Since at the beginning it started at 0, we ran the function, it increments by 1, and then it logs back the new value, and it's going to be 1. If we do this a couple times, then we're just going to see numbers incrementing by 1. This is the variable of current page. So there's another example of scope, that we're modifying this variable from within this function, because this function's inside the, it's on a lower level scope, then it can access a higher scope, the super variable or object. Again, if we have this variable defined inside this function, and then we try to increment this current page variable outside, we're going to get error because that's not defined. It's not defined in the scope of what we're trying, where we're trying to access it. All that we can access from this level is increment page, the function, not the variables inside the function, unless we do a return statement. We can't access them directly. There we go. Can't access directly. Object literals. An object literal is basically another form of container. You could think of it like that. It's just, it's a little neater. Well, regardless, you'll see it. I mean, you just getting from experience, you'll gain exactly what it is. But a very basic object literal definition would be var again, object literal, or whatever name that you want to call it, and equals open curly bracket, close curly bracket. Now inside the curly bracket space, we're going to define 3 variables. Some var 1, colon, hello, comma, some var 2, colon, hi, and another param, another var 7. So this is a basic definition of an object literal. The main thing to see here is that we're defining a variable the same way that we define all other variables with the equal sign. The only thing different is that we're passing in an open curly bracket and a closed curly bracket. Everything within the open and closed curly brackets is what's contained inside that object literal. And now that we're inside the object literal, you don't define variables by using the var keyword no more. You don't use the keyword, you just say the variable name, and then instead of using an equal sign, we're going to use a colon, and then define your variable the same exact way you would define any other variable, and then separate them by commas. The last thing is that the last line, or the last variable that you're defining inside your object literal, you're not going to close with a semicolon. you're just going to leave it open. And that's going to be the end of that object literal. If we wanted to add another variable to this, we would just add another comma and another variable. No semicolon, we just leave it open. So now if we log this to the console, we're going to see all the values of the variables inside the object. Object literal, there's the open curly bracket. This is the first parameter or variable. Second one, third one, fourth one. It's all there on the same level here. And then to access each of these variables inside our object literal individually, we could just do console.log object lit dot sum var1. That would output hello, and then all the other variables to another var and another var2. So then there, boom, we output all the contents of our object literal. That's the basics of defining object literals, storing variables inside object literals, and accessing the values of those individual variables. Object literals part 1, that was part 0, just the basic definition, is basically the same thing, just giving examples of storing functions and other object literals inside, also arrays, anything inside the object literal. It's just showing you how to do this. And if you store a function inside an object literal, then you could it's just for definition's sake, you could say that that function would now be a method of this object literal. So for example, we'll start with the function. If we still have, let's say, another object literal equals open curly bracket, close curly bracket, and inside here we're going to say init colon function parentheses curly bracket, curly bracket. Inside this init, we're just going to log another object literal has been initialized. So now what we did is that we have the same object literal definition, but now inside, instead of storing a variable or just a single variable, we're having an entire function defined inside this object literal, which is now a method of this object literal that we have. And in order to call that, for us to call that, we could just call another object literal dot init parentheses and then close it with a semicolon. So now when we run this, we should say another object literal has been initialized. Now we're running a function inside of an object literal. And again, you can pass parameters the same exact way that you would define in another function. The only difference is how I showed you earlier of how to define a function. Would be function init, like this, with the function before the actual function name, and then the contents, which would be, in this case, this, would be pasted inside here. Instead of doing it like this, now that we're defining it inside of an object literal, we're going to say the function name first, and then a colon, and then the function with an open parentheses, close parentheses, and then the contents of whatever commands you want to execute. And just how in this notation we would pass a parameter in through here, and to access it we would log initialized and then plus my param to check the value of whatever you grabbed in here. We're going to do it the same exact way inside these parentheses. So if we put some param in here, and then another object has been initialized, I'll just put with param and then plus some param. Now when we run this init function, If we just run it in it without passing a parameter, it should say undefined. And then if we run it with a parameter 700, it's going to output 700. Or if we write whatever we want, it's going to output that over here. So that's how you define a function inside an object literal that becomes the method of that object literal, and how you pass a parameter into the same function or method of that object literal. Passing another object literal inside of this object literal, we can define that like so. If we have our incept object literal, have another object literal inside of it defined as dream, we will define it the same way as we define a variable, with the name first, no variable keyword, and then a colon, and then another open curly bracket and a closed curly bracket. Now that we're inside the dream object literal, we can define a variable sec level and, you know, define that as whatever we want. And then we're going to store another object literal inside this object literal. We're going to call that whatever, careful. And then open curly bracket, close curly bracket, since it's an object literal, third level. So now we have careful as an object literal inside of dream as another object literal inside our main object literal, incept object literal. So now if we log our main object literal, which is incept object literal, we're going to see it's going to show us the first level, which is dream. It contains an object, which is an object literal. And then now if we open it, go further in, dream contains careful. On that same level, it's going to have sec level, which is just the 3 Z's. And then inside dream is another object literal named careful that has a third level with help. Looping in arrays. We've gone over the basics of an array, and we've gone over the basics of a for loop. So we're going to define lottery numbers equals a whole bunch of numbers in there. That doesn't make sense, but you get the point. If we log our entire array, lottery numbers, we're going to get the whole array, right? With the brackets and all, and the commas and everything. And then if we wanted to access an individual value inside this array, like let's say we wanted to get 5, then we would just call the index, in this case 2, because it starts with 0, 1, and 2, and then we would pass it into here inside of brackets. So this will output 5 for us. Now, if we wanted to output every value of this array, no matter how long the array is, every array, an array object, has a method called length that will return, the length of the array. So in this case, if we log lottery numbers dot length, it's going to give us not a value inside the array, but the actual how many values the array contains. So now that we can get this value, we can combine that with a for loop. And just to review, this is a basic for loop. Variable I equals 0, I is less than, some length, I plus plus. And then we have the contents inside the for loop. So using this method of the array object, now that we can get the lottery numbers length exact, we can use that in our for loop by setting that to the limit. So while I is less than the amount of values inside our lottery numbers array, we're going to keep on incrementing I. So in this case, if we log value at index plus I is equal to lottery numbers bracket I bracket. And again, this lottery numbers open bracket close bracket, this is how you access a value inside the array. Inside a for loop, now that we have lottery numbers bracket I, it's going to check for I every iteration of this for loop. So at the first iteration, it's going to start with 0, and then it's going to check if this condition is true, which is it is, since it's just going to be 0, and then it's going to increment I by 1. So the second iteration is going to pull the second value in this array, and so forth until it reaches to the end. So now if we run this, we're going to see the entire contents of the array. Value at index 0 is 3, value at index 1, and so forth until we get to the last value, which is 22 in our array. We can use this same method, well, not this same method, but we can, another, different method of using a for loop with an array would be if we have an empty array that has nothing in it, and then we have a for loop. We can write variable fill to this number equals 2000. Fill to this number we're going to use as the limit of I. So when I, again, it starts at 0 and then it's going to keep on incrementing by 1 until it reaches the value of this variable, fill to this number, which in this case is 2000. So now that we're inside this for loop, we can put lottery numbers dot push, which again inserts the value, whatever value that you pass inside these parameters at the end of the array. We can, just for example, we can just write hello plus I. So it's going to be hello 0, hello 1, hello 2, up until it reaches 2000. And then at the end of the for loop, we're going to log the value of our lottery numbers array. And again, how this works is that the code is going to come here, it's going to go down, it's going to use the for loop, and it's not going to run the following code until it finishes the for loop. So once it finishes pushing all these hello plus I values into this array, then it's going to log the value of the array. So now if we run this, we're going to see that it says hello 0 through hello 2000, or 1999, since we have the I is less than fills to this number, 2000.